Chapter 2. Discovery of the Sandwich Islands, exploration of the western shore of America, from thence to Bering Straits, return to the Howing Group, history of Roanoke, death of Cook, return of the expedition to England. On the 18th of January, 1778, in longitude 160 degrees and latitude 20 degrees north, the two vessels perceived the first islands of the Sandwich, or Howing Archipelago. It did not take long to convince the navigators that they were inhabited. A large number of pirogues left Atui or Tavai Island and surrounded the ships. The English were not a little surprised at hearing these natives speak in the Tahitan language. On this account, the intercourse between them was soon friendly, and next day numbers of the islanders agreed to go on board. They showed their astonishment and admiration at the sight of so many unknown objects by their looks, gestures, and continual exclamations. Iron they were acquainted with and called hamate. But their covetousness was soon excited by so many curiosities and precious things, and they tried to appropriate them both by honest and by illicit means. Their cleverness and their taste for thieving was as keen as is usual with the natives of the southern seas. It was necessary to take 1,000 precautions, and they were often taken in vain, to guard against their larceny. The English, when they approached the shore, under charge of Lieutenant Williamson, to sound and search for anchorage, were forced to repulse the attempts of the natives by force. The death of one of them repressed their turbulence in a measure, and gave them an exalted opinion of the strength of the new arrivals. As soon, however, as the Resolution and Discovery had cast anchor in Waimea Bay, Cook had himself taken on shore. He had scarcely touched land, when the natives assembled in a crowd upon the strand, prostrated themselves at his feet, and welcomed him with signs of the most profound respect. Cook's reception by the natives. Cook's reception by the natives. This extraordinary reception gave promise of a pleasant stay, for provisions appeared to be abundant. Fruits, pigs, fowls began to arrive from all parts. At the same time, a party of natives assisted the English sailors in filling the casks with water and in carrying them on board. Anderson and the draftsman Weller were encouraged by this friendly conduct to advance into the interior. They were not long in coming upon a morai, similar in every respect to the Tahitian morais. This discovery confirmed the English in the ideas induced by the similarity of the language with that of Tahiti. An engraving in Cook's narrative represents the interior of this morai. In it, two figures may be seen, standing, the top of the heads disappearing in high cylindrical hats, similar to those on the statues in Easter Island. In any case, the singular resemblance gives rise to reflection. Cook remained 2 days more in this anchorage, and could only extol the traffic with the natives. He then explored the neighboring island of Wanihio. In spite of his great wish to explore this interesting archipelago, he set sail, and from a distance perceived Wahoo Island and the reef of Tahura, which he designated by the general appellation of Sandwich Archipelago. This name has been superseded by the native appellation of Hawaii. Strong and vigorous, although of medium height, the Haugians are represented by Anderson as being of frank and loyal character. Not so serious as the natives of the Friendly Isles, they are less frivolous than the Tahitans. Clever, industrious, and intelligent, their plantations showed a knowledge of rural economy and an extensive taste for agriculture. They not only abstained from showing the childish and common curiosity which the English had so often noticed, but they inquired into their customs and evinced a certain regret for their own inferiority. The population appeared considerable, and was estimated at 30,000 in Tavai Island alone. In their style of dress, their choice of food, their manner of preparing it, and their general habits, they conformed to the customs of Tahiti. This identity of two populations separated by a large stretch of sea gave the English much food for reflection. During his first stay, Cook did not become acquainted with any chief, but Captain Clerk of the Discovery at last received a visit from one. He was a young and well-made man, wrapped up from head to foot. The natives testified their respect by kneeling before him. Clerk made him several presents, and in return received a vase decorated with two small figures, fairly well sculptured, which served for the kava, a favorite drink of the Hawaiians, as well as the natives of Tonga. Their weapons comprised bows, clubs, and lances, the latter made of a strong and durable wood, and a sort of poignard called pafoa, terminating in a point at both ends. The custom of tabu was just as universally practiced as in the Friendly Islands, and the natives were always careful to ask if things were taboo before they touched them. On the 27th of February, Cook continued his course to the north, and soon fell in with the sea wrack of the rocks mentioned by the narrator of Lord Anson's voyage. On the 1st of March, he steered for the east, in order to approach the American coast, and 5 days later he recognized New Albion, so named by Francis Drake. The expedition, coasting at a distance, surveyed Cape Blanc, already seen by Martin d'Aguilar on the 19th of January, 1603, and near which the geographers placed a large opening to the strait, the discovery of which they attributed to him. Shortly afterwards the latitude of Juan de Fuca was reached, but nothing resembling it was discovered, although this strait really exists, and divides the continent from Vancouver's island. Cook soon reconnoitered a bay in latitude 49 degrees 15, to which he gave the name of Hope Bay. He anchored there to obtain water and give a little rest to his worn-out crews. This coast was inhabited, and 3 boats approached the vessels. One of the savages, he says, rose up and with many gesticulations made a long speech, which we understood as an invitation to land. In addition, he threw feathers towards us, and many of his companions threw us handfuls of dust or red powder. The native who usurped the post of orator was clothed in a skin, and in each hand he held something which he shook, and which emitted a sound like that of a child's rattle. When he was tired of haranguing and exhorting, of which we did not understand a word, he rested, but 2 other men took up the speech in succession. Their speeches were not so long, and they did not declaim so vehemently. Many of the natives had their faces painted in an extraordinary way and feathers fixed in their heads. Although they appeared friendly, it was impossible to persuade any of them to come on board. However, as the vessels had cast anchor, the captain had the sails furled, took in the topmasts, and unrigged the mizzen mast of the Resolution, in order to allow of repairs. Barter with the Indians soon commenced, and the most rigorous honesty prevailed. The objects offered were bear and wolf skins, and those of foxes, deers and polecats, weasels and especially otters, which are found in the islands east of Kamchatka. Also clothes made of a kind of hemp, bows, lances, fishhooks, monstrous figures, and a kind of stuff of hair or wool, bags filled with red ochre, bits of sculptured wood, trinkets of copper and iron shaped like horseshoes, which they wore hung from the nose. Human ears and hands, not yet free from flesh, struck us most among the things they offered us. They made us clearly understand that they had eaten the portions that were missing, and we indeed perceived that these hands and ears had been on the fire. The English were not long in ascertaining that these natives were as habitual robbers as any they had hitherto met with. They were even more dangerous, as, possessing iron implements, they could easily cut the cords. They combined their thefts with intelligence, and one of them amused the sentinel at one end of the boat, whilst another snatched the iron from the other end. They sold a quantity of very good oil, and a great deal of fish, especially sardines. When the numerous repairs needed by the ships were made, and the grass required for the few goats and sheep remaining on board had been shipped, Cook set sail on the 26th of April, 1778. He gave the name of King George's Sound to the spot where he had stayed, although it was called Nootka by the natives. The vessels had scarcely gained the open sea when a violent tempest overtook them, during which the Resolution sprung a leak on the starboard side below the water line. Carried away by the storm, Cook passed the spot selected by geographers as the situation of the Strait of Admiral de Font, though he greatly wished to dispel all doubt on the subject. The captain therefore continued along the American coast, surveying and naming the principal points. During this cruise he had constant intercourse with the Indians, and was not slow in noticing that their canoes had been replaced by boats, of which only the framework was wood, and over which were spread seal skins. Prince William Sound. Prince William Sound. After a stay at Prince William Sound, where the leak of the Resolution was repaired, Cook resumed his voyage, reconnoitered and named Elizabeth and St. Hermogene Capes, Banks Point, Capes Douglas and Bede, St. Augustine's Mount, the River Cook, Kodiak Island, Trinity Island, and the islands called Shumagen by Bering. Afterwards he passed Bristol Bay, Round Island, Calm Point, Newnham Cape, where Lieutenant Williamson landed, and Anderson Island, so called in honor of the naturalist, who died there of disease of the chest. Later, King Island and Prince of Wales's Cape, the most western extremity of America. Cook then passed the Asiatic coast and entered into communication with the Teachauchis, entered Bering Strait on the 11th of April, and next week came in contact with ice. He tried in vain to survey in various directions. The iceberg presented an insuperable barrier. On the 17th of April, 1778, the expedition was in latitude 70 degrees 41. During an entire month he coasted the iceberg, in the hope of finding an opening which might enable him to proceed to the north, but in vain. It was remarked that the ice was clear and transparent except in the upper part, which was slightly porous. I supposed, says Cook, that it was frozen snow, and it appeared to me that it must have been formed in the open sea, both because it is improbable, or rather impossible, that such enormous masses could float down rivers which contain too little water for a boat, and also because we perceived no produce of the earth, which we must have done if it was so formed. Up to this date, the passage through Bering Strait had been the least used to reach the northern latitudes. Cook's observation is valuable, as it proves that beyond this aperture a vast extent of sea without land must exist. It may possibly be, this was the view held by the lamented Gustave Lambert, that this sea is open. No greater distance north has ever been attained since Cook's time, except on the Siberian coast, where Plover and Long Islands were discovered, and where at this moment, as we write, Professor Nordenskjöld is exploring. 1. 1 on the 5th September, 1879, a telegram from Stockholm announced that the Swedish Arctic expedition under Professor Nordenskjöld had made the Northeast Passage from Europe to Japan, and that the Swedish exploring vessel, the Vega, had arrived at Yokohama by way of Bering Straits. Translator. After most careful exploration and repeated efforts to reach higher latitudes, Cook, seeing that the season was advanced and encountering more icebergs daily, had no choice but to seek winter quarters in a more clement country, before continuing his expedition the following summer. He therefore retraced his route as far as Unalaska Island, and on the 26th of October steered towards the Sandwich Islands, hoping to complete his survey of them during his wintering there. An island was discovered on the 26th of November. The natives sold a quantity of fruits, roots, breadfruits, potatoes, taro, and eddy roots, which they exchanged for nails and iron implements. It was Maui Island, which forms part of the Sandwich Archipelago. Shortly afterwards, Ohihi or Hawaii was sighted, the summits of which were covered with snow. The captain says, "We never met savages so liberal as these in their views. They usually sent the different articles they wished to sell to the ships. They then came on board themselves and finished their trade on the quarterdeck. The Tahitans, in spite of our constant stays there, have not the same confidence in us. I conclude from this that the inhabitants of Ohihi are more accurate and true in their reciprocal trade than those of Tahiti, for the latter have no honor among themselves, and are thus not inclined to believe in the honor of others." On the 17th of January, Cook and Clerke cast anchor in a bay, called by the natives Karakakwa. The sails were unbent from the yards and the topmasts struck. The vessels were crowded with visitors and surrounded by pirogues, and the shore was covered by a curious multitude. Cook had never previously seen so much excitement. Among the chiefs who came on board the Resolution, a young man named Persia was soon remarked. He said he was Ayakani, but it was not known that was his title of office, or if it suggested a degree of relationship or alliance with the king. However, he evidently had great authority over the common people. Some presents, opportunely given, attached him to the English, and he rendered them more than one service. If Cook on his first visit to Hawaii pronounced that the natives were little disposed to robbery, he was not of the same opinion this time. Their large numbers gave them many facilities for thieving trifles, and encouraged them to think that their larceny would not be punished. It became evident at last that they were encouraged by their chiefs, for several stolen objects were found in the possession of the latter. Peria and another chief named Kanina brought an old man on board, whose name was Ko. He was very thin, and his body was covered with white scurf from immoderate use of ava. He was a priest. When he was presented to Cook, he put a sort of red mantle which he had brought upon his shoulders, and gravely delivered a long discourse as he gave him a little pig. It was soon proved that it was intended as a form of adoration, for all the idols were clothed in similar stuff. The English were immensely astonished at the whimsical ceremonies of homage presented to Cook. They only understood them later, through the researches of the learned missionary Ellis. We shall give a brief account of his interesting discovery. It will make the recital of the events that followed plainer. They gave him a little pig. They gave him a little pig. According to tradition, a certain Rono who lived under one of the ancient kings of Hawaii had killed his wife, whom he tenderly loved in a transport of jealousy. The grief and sorrow which followed upon his act drove him mad. He ran about the island, quarreling with and striking everybody. At last, tired out but not satiated with murder, he embarked, promising to return one day, upon a floating island, bringing coconuts, pigs, and dogs. This legend had been embodied in a national song, and became an article of faith with the priests, who added Rono to their list of deities. Confident in the fulfillment of the prediction, they awaited his coming every year with a patience which nothing could exhaust. Is not there a strange resemblance between this legend and that relating to the Mexican god Quetzalcoatl, who, forced to fly from the wrath of a more powerful god, embarked upon a skiff of serpent skin, promising those who accompanied him to return at some later time and visit the country with his descendants? As soon as the English ships appeared, the high priest Ko and his son One-Law declared that it was Rono himself, fulfilling his prediction. From that moment, Cook was a divinity for the entire population. As he went about, the natives prostrated themselves. The priests made him speeches or addressed prayers to him. They would have sprinkled him with incense had that been fashionable at Hawaii. The captain felt that there was something extraordinary in these demonstrations, but, unable to understand it, he resigned himself for the sake of his crew, and for the advancement of science to the mysterious circumstances he was unable to unravel. He was obliged to give himself up to all kinds of ceremonies, which appeared, to him at least, ridiculous. Thus he was taken to a morai, a solid construction of stone 40 roods long and 14 high. The summit was well built and was surrounded by a wooden balustrade, upon which were hung the ears of the captives sacrificed to the gods. At the opening of the platform were two large wooden figures with grinning faces and bodies draped in red stuff, the heads surmounted by a large piece of sculptured wood, the shape of a reversed cone. Their mounted with Cook upon a sort of table, under which lay a rotten pig and a quantity of fruit. Some men brought a living pig in a procession, and some scarlet cloth in which it was wrapped. The priests then sang some religious hymns, while the assistants were devoutly prostrated at the entrance of the morai. After various ceremonies, which it would take too long to describe, a pig, cooked in the oven, was presented to the captain, with fruits and the roots which were used in the preparation of ava. The ava, says Cook, was then handed round, and when we had tasted it, Ko and Peria divided the flesh of the pig into several pieces, which they placed in our mouths. I felt no repugnance when Peria, who is very clean, gave me something to eat, says Lieutenant King, but Cook, to whom Ko offered the same attention, could not swallow a morsel, as he thought of the putrid pig. The old man, wishing to redouble his politeness, tried to give him pieces already chewed, and one can easily imagine that the disgust of our captain increased. After this ceremony, Cook was conducted to his boat, by 4 men carrying sticks, who repeated the same words and phrases as at the landing, in the midst of a kneeling host of the natives. The same ceremonies were observed every time the captain landed. One of the priests always walked before him, announcing that Rono had landed and ordering the people to prostrate themselves. If the English had reason to feel satisfied with the priests, who loaded them with attentions and presents, it was otherwise with the Cares, or warriors. The latter encouraged the robberies which were perpetrated daily, and in other ways exhibited disloyalty. Still, up to the 24th of January, 1779, no important event occurred. Upon that day, the English were surprised to see that none of the pirogues left the river to trade with the ships. The arrival of Teriabu had made the bay tabu, and prevented any communication with the strangers. Upon the same day, the chief, or rather king, went without ceremony to the ships. He had but one pirogue, in which were his wife and children. On the 26th, Teriabu paid a second visit, which was official. Cook, says the narrative, noticing that the prince landed, followed him and arrived about the same time. He conducted them to the tent. They were scarcely seated when the prince rose, and in a graceful manner threw his mantle over the captain's shoulders. He further placed a hat of feathers upon his head, and a curious fan in Cook's hands, at whose feet he also spread 5 or 6 very pretty mantles of great value. Teriabu and the principal chiefs of his suite asked many questions of the English as to the time of their leaving. The captain wished to ascertain the opinion the Hawaiians had formed of the English, but he could only learn that they supposed them to be the natives of a country where provisions were scarce, and that they had simply come there to fill their stomachs. This conviction arose from the emaciated appearance of some of the sailors, and from the desire to ship fresh victuals. There was no fear, however, of exhausting their provisions, in spite of the immense quantity which had been consumed since the English arrived. It is very likely that the king wished for time to prepare the present he intended to offer the strangers upon their leaving, and accordingly, the day before the one fixed upon, the king begged captain's cook and clerk to accompany him to his residence. Enormous heaps of every kind of vegetable, parcels of stuffs, yellow and red feathers, and a herd of pigs were collected together. All this was a gratuitous gift to the king from his subjects. Teriabu chose about a third of these articles and gave the rest to the 2 captains, a more valuable present than they had ever received either at Tonga or Tahiti. On the 4th of February, the vessels left the bay, but the damage received by the Resolution forced her to put in again in a few days. The vessels had scarcely cast anchor before the English noticed a change in the conduct of the natives. Still, all went on peaceably until the afternoon of the 13th. Upon that day, several chiefs wished to prevent the natives from assisting the English in filling their casks. A tumult ensued. The natives armed themselves with stones and became threatening. The officer in command of the detachment was ordered by Cook to draw upon the natives if they persisted in throwing stones or became insolent. Under these circumstances, a pirogue was fired into, and it was soon apparent that a robbery had been committed by its crew. At the same time, a still more serious dispute arose. A sloop belonging to Persia was seized by an officer, who took it to the Discovery. The chief hastened to claim his belongings and to protest his innocence. The discussion grew animated, and Persia was overthrown by a blow from an oar. The natives, who had hitherto been peaceable observers, armed themselves with stones, forced the sailors to retire precipitately, and took possession of the pinnace which had brought them. Persia, forgetful of his resentment at this moment, interposed and restored the pinnace to the English, together with several things which had been stolen. "I am afraid the Indians will force me to violent measures," said Cook, upon learning what had passed. "We must not allow them to believe that they have gained an advantage over us." The boat of the Discovery was stolen upon the 13th or 14th of February. The captain determined to possess himself of the person of Teriabu, or some others of the leading persons, and to keep them as hostages until the stolen objects were restored to him. He therefore landed with a detachment of marines and pursued his way to the king's residence. He was received with the usual marks of respect on the road, and perceiving Teriabu and his two sons, to whom he said a few words on the theft of the sloop, he decided to pass the day on board the Resolution. The matter took a happy turn, and the two young princes embarked upon the pinnace, when one of Teriabu's wives begged him with tears not to go on board. Two other chiefs joined her, and the natives, frightened by the hostile preparations they saw, began to crowd round the king and captain. The latter hurried to embark, and the prince appeared willing to follow him, but the chiefs interposed and used force to prevent his doing so. Cook, seeing that his project had failed, and that he could only put it into execution by bloodshed, gave it up and walked quietly along the shore to regain his boat, when a rumor spread that one of the principal chiefs had been killed. The women and children were therefore sent away, and all directed their attention to the English. A native armed with a pahua defied the captain, and as he would not cease his threats, Cook discharged his pistol. The native, protected by a thick mat, did not feel himself wounded, and so became more audacious. Several others advanced, and the captain discharged his gun at the nearest and killed him. This was the signal for a general attack. The last that was seen of Cook was his signing to the boats to cease firing, and to approach that his small troop might embark. In vain, the captain was struck and fell to the earth. The natives, says the narrative, uttered cries of joy when they saw him fall. They at once dragged his body along the shore, and taking the poniard one after the other, they all attacked him with ferocious blows until he ceased to breathe. Thus perished this great navigator, assuredly the most illustrious produced by England. The boldness of his undertakings, his perseverance in carrying them out, and the extent of his knowledge, all made him a type of the true sailor of discovery. Itinerary of the principal voyagers during the 18th century, after Cook. Grave par e moriu. Facsimile of early engraving. What immense service he has rendered to geography. In his first voyage, he reconnoitered the Society Islands, proved that New Zealand is formed of two islands, explored the strait that separates them, and surveyed its coast, and lastly he visited the entire eastern coast of New Holland. In his second voyage, he proved the chimerical character of the long-talked-of Antarctic continent, the dream of stay-at-home geographers. He discovered New Caledonia, southern Georgia, the Sandwich Islands, and penetrated farther into the southern hemisphere than anyone had done before him. In his third expedition, he discovered the Hawaiian archipelago and surveyed the eastern coast of America, to the 43rd degree, that is to say, an extent of 3,500 miles. He passed through Bering Straits and ventured into the Arctic Sea, which was the horror of navigators, until the icebergs opposed an impenetrable barrier to his progress. It is needless to praise his qualities as a seaman. His hydrographical works remain, But above all, his careful treatment of his crews deserves to be remembered. To it was due their ability to bear the long and trying voyages, which he made with so little loss of life. After this fatal day, the English folded their tents and returned on board. Their offers for the recovery of the body of their unfortunate captain were in vain. In their anger, they were about to have recourse to arms, when two priests, friends of Lieutenant King, brought a piece of human flesh at the instance of the other chiefs, which weighed from 9 to 10 pounds. It was all, they said, that remained of Roano's body, which had been burnt according to custom. This sight, of course, made the English still more anxious for reprisals, and the natives on their side had to avenge the death of 5 chiefs and a score of men. Every time the English landed at their watering place, they found a furious crowd armed with stones and sticks. In order to make an example, Captain Clerke, who had taken the command of the expedition, set fire to the abodes of the priests and massacred those who opposed them. On the 19th of February, however, an interview was arranged, and the remains of Cook, his hands, recognizable by a large scar, his head, stripped of flesh and various other debris, were made over to the English, who 3 days later paid them the last honors. After that, barter was resumed as if nothing had happened, and no other incident occurred during the remainder of the stay in the Sandwich Islands. Captain Clerke had relinquished the command of the Discovery to Lieutenant Gore and hoisted his flag upon the Resolution. After completing the survey of the Hawaiian Islands, he set sail for the north, touched at Kamchatka, where the Russians made him heartily welcome, passed through Bering Strait, and advanced as far as latitude 69 degrees 50 north, where his further progress was barred by icebergs. On the 22nd of April, 1779, Captain Clerke died of pulmonary phthisis, aged 38. Captain Gore then assumed the command-in-chief, put in again at Kamchatka, again at Canton, and at the Cape of Good Hope, and anchored in the Thames on the 1st of October, 1780, after more than 4 years' absence. The death of Captain Cook caused a general mourning throughout England. The Royal Society of London, of which he was a member, struck a medal in his honor, the cost of which was covered by public subscription, to which persons of the highest rank subscribed. The Admiralty petitioned the king to provide for the family of the deceased captain. The king granted a pension of 200 to his widow, Annal, to each of his 3 sons. The charts and drawings relating to his last voyage were engraved at the expense of the government, and the proceeds of their sale divided among Cook's family and the heirs of Captain Clerke and Captain King. Although the family of the great navigator is extinct, a proof of the esteem in which his memory is held was given in the solemn meeting of the French Geographical Society on the 4th of February, 1879. A large number assembled to celebrate the centenary of Cook's death. Amongst them were many representatives of the Australian colonies, which are now so flourishing, and of the Hawaiian archipelago, where he met his death. A quantity of relics belonging to the great navigator, his charts, Weber's magnificent watercolors, and the instruments and weapons of the oceanic islanders decorated the walls. This touching homage, after the lapse of 100 years, was accorded by a people whose king had bidden them not to thwart Cook's scientific and civilizing mission, and was well calculated to awaken echo in England, and to draw yet closer the bonds of that good fellowship which exists between England and France. End of the first part. Part 2. Death of Captain Cook. Chapter 1. French Navigators. 1. Discoveries made by Bouvet de Lozier in the southern seas. Surville, the land of the Arsacides. Incident during the stay at Port Praslin. Arrival upon the coast of New Zealand. Death of Surville. Marion's discoveries in the Antarctic Ocean. He is murdered at New Zealand. Kerguelen in Iceland and the Antarctic regions. The contest between the watches, Fleurien and Verdun de la Crenne. In the earlier half of the 18th century, a discovery had been made which was destined to exercise a favorable influence upon the progress of geographical science. Jean-Baptiste Charles Bouvet de Lozier, a captain of one of the East India Company's ships, was so struck by the immensity of the space surrounding the southern pole, known to geographers as the Terra Australis Incognita, that he begged for the privilege of prosecuting discoveries in these unknown regions. His importunities were long disregarded, but at length, in 1738, the company consented, in the hope of opening new facilities for trade. 2 small frigates, the Aigle and the Marie, fully equipped, left Brest upon the 19th of July, 1738, under command of Bouvet de Lozier. After a stay of a month at St. Catherine's Island, upon the coast of Brazil, they put to sea again upon the 13th of November and steered for the southeast. On the 26th, heavy fog set in, so that the vessels could only keep in company by constant firing, and were obliged to tack about continually, at the risk of running foul of each other. Upon the 5th of December, although it would have appeared impossible, the fog increased in density to such an extent that those on board the Aigle could hear the movement of the Marie, though they could not see her. The sea was covered with kelp, and seagulls, never found at a distance from land, were shortly afterwards seen. Upon the 15th of December, says M. Favre, in his memoir The Bouvets in 48 degrees 50 S. lat. Paris is in N. lat. 48 degrees 50 and in 7 degrees W. long. The meridian of Tenerife, an enormous iceberg was perceived towards 5 or 6 in the morning. Shortly afterwards many others were seen, surrounded by ice floes of various sizes. The Marie, signaling danger, tacked about, but Bouvet, annoyed by this action, which was likely to affect the confidence of the crews, crowded sail on the Aigle, and by passing the Marie, showed his determination to maintain his southern course. To reassure his men, he asserted that it was considered a lucky omen to meet with ice, as it was a certain indication of land at hand. The course was continued to the south, and Bouvet's perseverance was soon rewarded by the appearance of land, to which he gave the name of Cape Circumcision. It was steep, covered with snow, and so shut in by large icebergs that it was impossible to approach to within 7 or 8 leagues. It appeared to measure from 4 to 5 leagues from north to south. This land was supposed, says M. Favre, judging from Pietergo's charts which were used by Bouvet, to be situated in 54 degrees S. lat. and degrees east of the meridian of Tenerife, or between 5 degrees 30 and degrees 3 east of that of Paris. Bouvet would much have liked to make closer acquaintance with this region, but the fogs and contrary winds prevented his reaching it, and he was obliged to satisfy himself with observing it from a distance. Upon the 3rd of January 1739, says Bouvet in his report to the company, we made up for what we had lost during the preceding days, and about 4 in the afternoon, the fog clearing somewhat, we distinctly saw land. The coast, broken throughout its entire length, formed several bays. The summits of the mountains were covered with snow, the sides appeared wooded. After several fruitless attempts to near the coast, Bouvet was forced to relinquish the idea. His sailors were worn out with fatigue, discouraged, and enfeebled by scurvy. The Marie was sent to the Isle of France, and the Aigle directed her course to the Cape of Good Hope, which she reached upon the 28th of February. We had penetrated, says Bouvet, in the report already cited, 12 or 1500 leagues into an unknown sea. For 70 days we had encountered almost continuous fog. We had been for 40 days in the midst of ice, and we had had snow and hail almost every day. Several times our decks and rigging were covered with them. Our shrouds and sails were frozen. On the 10th of January, it was impossible to work our foretopsail. The cold was severe, for men accustomed to a warm climate and who were lightly clad. Many had chilblains on the hands and feet. Still, they were forced constantly to tack about, bring to, get under way, and take soundings at least once a day. One of the sailors belonging to the Aigle, having been sent to loosen the foretopsail, became frozen in the foretop. He had to be lowered by a whip, and circulation was with difficulty restored. I have seen others with tears gushing from their eyes as they handled the sounding line. And all this was in the fine season, and I ameliorated their condition by every means in my power. We can readily understand that such small results did not tempt the East India Company to continue their efforts in these latitudes. If they were productive of no good, they cost heavily in the loss of men and ships they entailed. Still, Bouvet's discovery was a first blow to the existing belief in an Antarctic continent. He gave the start, and various navigators, amongst them 2 Frenchmen, followed it up. In our short record of this expedition, which is scarcely known, we have testified to an appreciation of our countryman, who was the pioneer of Antarctic navigation, and who deserves the credit of furnishing an example to the great English explorer, James Cook. Another of the East India Company's captains, who had distinguished himself in various battles against the English, Jean-François Marie de Surville, was destined to make important discoveries in Oceania some 30 years later, and to rediscover, almost simultaneously with Cook, the lands first seen by Tasman, and which he called Staten Island. The following is an account of the circumstances. Messrs. Law and Chevalier, governors in French India, determined to send a vessel at their own risk to trade in the southern seas. They admitted Surville to their schemes and sent him to France to obtain the needful authority from the company and to superintend the equipment of the vessel. The Saint Jean Baptiste was made ready for sea at Nantes and provisioned for 3 years, with every requisite for a distant expedition. Surville then reached India, where Law provided him with 24 native soldiers. Leaving Angli Bay on the 3rd of March, 1769, the Saint Jean Baptiste put in successively at Masulipatam, Yangon, and Pondicherry, where her equipment was completed. Surville left the last-named port on the 2nd of June and steered his course for the Philippines. On the 20th of August, he cast anchor off the Bashies, or Bashi Islands. Dampier had so named them after an intoxicating drink, which the natives compounded from the juice of the sugar cane, into which they infused a certain black seed. Several of Dampier's crew had formerly deserted in these islands. They had received from the natives a field, agricultural instruments, and wives. The recollection of this fact incited 3 of the sailors belonging to the Saint Jean Baptiste to follow their example. But Surville was not the man to allow his crew to melt away in such a manner. He seized 26 Indians and signified his intention of keeping them as hostages until his men were brought back to him. Among the Indians thus seized, says Crozet, in his narrative of Surville's voyage, there were several courageous enough to throw themselves into the sea, and much to the surprise of the crew, they had sufficient courage and skill to swim to one of their pirogues, which was far enough from the vessel to be secure from danger. Pains were taken to make the savages understand that they had been treated in this way in order to make their comrades bring back the 3 deserters. They made signs that they understood, and were then released with the exception of 6, who had been taken on shore. The haste with which they left the ship and flung themselves into their pirogues augured badly for their return. Much surprise was therefore felt when in a short time they were seen returning with joyful acclamations. Doubt was no longer possible. They could only be bringing the deserters back to the commander. They came on board and proceeded to deposit on deck, what? 3 magnificent pigs, tied and bound. Surville did not appreciate, and he objurgated the natives so fiercely that they jumped into their pirogues and disappeared. 24 hours later, the Saint Jean Baptiste left the Bashies, taking 3 captive Indians to replace the deserters. Map of Surville's discoveries after Fleurieu. Upon the 7th of October, after a lengthened route to the southeast, land, to which the name of Premier View was given, was sighted in 6 degrees 56 S lat and degrees 30 long, east of Paris. The explorers coasted along it until the 13th October, upon which day an excellent port was discovered, sheltered from every wind and formed by a number of small islands. M. de Surville cast anchor and named it Port Praslin. It is situated in 7 degrees 25 S lat and degrees 55 E long, reckoning from the Paris meridian. Upon entering this port, the French saw several Indians, armed with spears and carrying a sort of shield. The Saint Jean Baptiste was very soon surrounded by pirogues, manned by a crowd of Indians, who were profuse in menacing gestures. However, they were pacified at last. About 30 of the boldest clambered onto the deck and examined everything they saw with close attention. It soon became needful to check their advances, as there were many sick among the crew, and it was unwise to allow too many natives on board. Pirogues of the Admiralty Islands. Pirogues of the Admiralty Islands. Facsimile of early engraving. In spite of the welcome they received, the natives were still doubtful, and their looks expressed distrust. The slightest movement on board the vessel was sufficient to make them jump into their pirogues, or the sea. One only showed a little more confidence, and Surville gave him several presents. The Indian acknowledged the attention by saying he could point out a spot where good water was to be had. The captain gave orders to arm the boats and entrusted the command to his lieutenant Lab. The savages appeared impatient for the departure of the boats from the ship, says Fleurien, in his Découvertes des Franchise, and they were no sooner lowered than they were followed by all the pirogues. One of these appeared to lead the others. In it was the Indian who had offered his services to Surville. At the back of the pirogue, a man stood erect, holding in his hands a bunch of herbs, raising them above his head with a rhythmical movement. In the center of the same pirogue stood a young man, resting upon a spear, who gravely watched all that went on. Red flowers were in his ears and passed through the cartilage of his nose, and his hair was powdered with white lime. Certain trifling symptoms aroused the suspicions of the French, who soon found themselves in a cul-de-sac. where the natives persisted in declaring that fresh water was to be found. Lab, in spite of all the persuasions of the natives, did not wish to imperil his boats in 2 or 3 feet of water with a muddy bottom, and therefore allowed only a corporal and 4 soldiers to disembark. They soon returned, asserting that they had seen on all sides nothing but marsh, in which the men would sink to the waist. It was evident that the natives had meditated treason. Lab took good care not to let them suspect that he had detected their design and asked them to point out a spring. The natives then led the boat some 3 leagues away, to a spot from whence it was impossible to see the ship. The corporal was again sent forward with some men, but he found only a very poor spring, barely affording sufficient water to slake the thirst of his party. During his absence, the natives did all in their power to induce Lab to land, pointing out to him the abundant coconut and other fruit trees, and even attempting to possess themselves of the boathook. More than 250 of these natives, says the narrative, armed with spears from 7 to 8 feet long, with swords or wooden clubs, arrows, and stones, and some carrying shields, were assembled on the shore, observing the movements of the boats. When the detachment, consisting of 5 men, proceeded to re-embark, the natives fell upon them, wounding 1 soldier with a blow from a club, the corporal with a spear, and many others in different ways. Lab himself was hit by 2 arrows in the thigh, and on the leg by a stone. The traitors were fired upon. The first volley so astonished them that they remained motionless. It was the more fatal, as, being fired only 3 or 5 fathoms from the boats, every shot took effect. The amazement of the natives gave the opportunity for a second discharge, which completely routed them, the death of their chief greatly hastening their flight. Lab, who had recognized him, apart from the others, with his hands raised to heaven, striking his breast, and encouraging the assailants by his voice, aimed at him and shot him dead. The natives carried off their wounded, leaving 30 or 40 dead upon the field of battle. It was then possible to land, and picking up such of the enemy's weapons as were scattered about, the victors contented themselves with towing away one of their pirogues and destroying the others. Picking up the enemy's weapons. Picking up the enemy's weapons. Serville was extremely anxious to capture an Indian, who might serve him as a guide, and who, convinced of the superiority of European weapons, might warn his countrymen against opposing the French. With this view, he hit upon a singular expedient. He ordered 2 Negro sailors to be placed on board the pirogue he had seized, had their heads powdered, and disguised them so cleverly that the natives were likely to be deceived. In fact, a pirogue soon after approaching the Saint Jean-Baptiste, the men who were in it, seeing what they took to be 2 of their own people trafficking with the strangers, drew nearer. So soon as the French imagined they were at a fair distance, they launched 2 boats in pursuit. The natives gained ground. It was then decided to fire in order to stop them. One of the natives was killed at once, and his boat capsizing, he fell into the sea, and the other, who was only 14 or 15 years of age, endeavored to reach the shore by swimming. He defended himself most courageously, says the narrative, sometimes making believe to bite himself, but really biting those who held him. His hands and feet were tied, and he was taken on board. He counterfeited death for an hour, but when he was made to sit up and he fell back on deck, he took good care to fall on his shoulders instead of his head. When he was tired of playing this game, he opened his eyes, and seeing that the crew were eating, he asked for a biscuit, ate it with a good appetite, and made many expressive signs. He was bound securely so that he might not throw himself overboard. During the night, it was necessary to resort to firing, to disperse the pirogues, which approached with a view to surprising the ship. Next day, the native was taken in a boat to a small islet, since called Aiguade Island. Scarcely had he landed when it was perceived that he had almost cut through the ropes with a sharp shell. The young savage was taken by a different route to the shore. When he perceived that he was to re-embark, he rolled upon the ground, shrieking and biting the sand in his fury. The sailors succeeded at last in finding an abundant spring and plenty of wood. One of the trees they cut appeared to have dyeing properties, for it tinged the sea with red. Some of the bark was boiled, and pieces of cotton steeped in the decoction turned deep red. Welcome refreshment was afforded to the crew by the palm cabbages, good oysters, and various shellfish which abounded. There were indeed many sufferers from scurvy on board the Saint Jean-Baptiste. Serville had looked forward to this stay to cure them, but the rain, which fell ceaselessly for 6 days, aggravated their complaint to such a degree that 3 of them died before they left the anchorage.